On today's show, the Houston Rockets signed Fred VanVleet to a brand new contract and how it impacts their team building moving forward. Plus, will we see any movement from the Houston Rockets in the second night of the NBA draft? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Exciting news to talk about on today's show. Fred VanVleet, brand new contract with the Houston Rockets, 2 years, $50 million, as reported by Shams Charania, with a player option in year 2. We'll break down what that contract means and how it impacts the Rockets' financials going forward in just a moment. We'll also take a look at the relatively quiet, not even relatively quiet, absolutely just no noise during the first round of the NBA draft from the Houston Rockets. There were some reports they might be trying to trade back into the draft. Will we see any movement out of the Rockets in the second round of the draft? Talk about that, as well as a little bit of just general draft reaction, in particular with the Phoenix Suns actually making some decent moves, which is not good for the long-term future of those Suns picks that the Rockets still own. So we'll talk about all of that on today's show. Let's start with the big stuff, though. Fred VanVleet, brand new contract. Houston Rockets decline his team option and renegotiate a 2-year, $50 million deal with a player option in year 2. Look, awesome deal for the Houston Rockets. We've been kicking around what a Fred VanVleet contract would look like for what feels like a couple months now on the show. We've done multiple different episodes talking about, speculating. Would it be, 3 years, $60 million? Would it be 3 years, $100 million? Would it be 3 years, $75 million? We've gone back and forth with all these numbers. 2 years, $50 million is fantastic value for Fred VanVleet, and credit to Rafael Stone and Eli Whitus and the rest of the Rockets front office, and also credit to Fred, because at the end of the day, Fred wants to be here in Houston. The Rockets want Fred VanVleet as their continued point guard, at least for now, until Reed Shepherd is ready to take the reins somewhere down the line. He is very much the heart and soul of this Rockets team. He's the emotional leader of this Rockets team. And with them trying to compete at the highest level right now, it's important to be able to keep all these pieces in place. Fred's been a gigantic part of the Rockets' turnaround. He's an extension of Ime Udoka on the floor. This was a no-brainer. This was always going to be the outcome, unless there was some wild out there crazy scenario where a trade somehow presented itself where they absolutely needed to use Fred VanVleet's $45 million salary. This was going to be the outcome of Fred VanVleet's contract situation, a brand new deal that's incredibly team friendly. And people might be wondering, why did Fred VanVleet give back so much money, right? He's taking a $20 million pay cut on this new deal. I think the better way to look at it is the fact that the Rockets vastly overpaid for Fred's services when he originally came here. They had to pay the quote-unquote loser tax to steal Fred VanVleet away from the Toronto Raptors. So they overpaid for 2 years. That third year was never going to get picked up, right? The third year being tacked on, the $44.9 million, that was basically a way for Fred and his agent to parade around and be like, we got a 3-year max, right? It is what it is. But if you take the 2 years that he did earn on the overpaid contract, and then these next 2 years where he will be making $25 million a year, and if you average it out across all 4 years, shout out to my guy Yossi Goslin who broke it down, the math. if you average it out across all 4 years, he'll be making $33.4 million annually across the lifespan of these two contracts across all 4 years. And $33.4 million is about the value that you'd expect for Fred VanVleet. Maybe a little more than what you'd be comfortable paying him on a like flat out regular contract. Again, I think $30 million is about that sweet spot for a guy of Fred's stature, and not stature, NBA stature, not like height stature. But a guy, that brings to the table what Fred does as a leader, as a playmaker, as a secondary or tertiary scorer on some nights, the mentorship that he provides to the young guys, all that stuff, right? Fred's about a $25 to $30 million player, give or take, plus the defense, right? You can't ignore that side of the basketball either. So for the Rockets and Fred VanVleet to be able to come to this type of an agreement where his salary drops tremendously going into this next season, it adds a lot of flexibility for the Houston Rockets moving forward. It gives them a lot of flexibility beneath both of the aprons, the first and the second apron. It'll mean that they should, on paper, be able to have access to their full non-taxpayer MLE worth $14.1 million. Now, they might not use all of that because, as we talked about in our kind of cap breakdown episode just before this one, it might behoove the Rockets to avoid the luxury tax this upcoming season, if at all possible, before entering the luxury tax in subsequent seasons due to the penalties of the repeater tax, of being in the luxury tax multiple consecutive years in a row, and how that kind of factors and how that ultimately can really restrict you a little bit further down the line with other different payroll considerations and complications and all that stuff. So, and the other significant benefit here, with it only being a 2-year deal instead of committing to a 3 or a 4-year deal with Fred VanVleet, even just flat out assuming like it's a 2-year deal and like he'll be here for 2 years. Now, that's not even a fully guaranteed option, because that second year is a player option on his contract, and there is going to be a lot of money flying around next offseason. It is being called a robust market. There are a lot of cap analysts who are looking at next summer as a summer where players are going to get flat out paid. And so for Fred, it might be an opportunity for him to look at declining that player option, leveraging another team against the Rockets, and basically saying, look, I could go to XYZ location. I can go to Washington and go lead their young guys there, whatever. They're willing to pay me this bag. I need you to match it or I'm going to leave. That might be the case. So it might only mean one more year of Fred VanVleet, but the length of that contract, be it just 1 year if he decides to bounce next summer for more money, or 2 years if he decides to pick up the player option because nobody out there wants to actually pay him $25 million, the shorter shelf life of that contract is ultimately better for the Rockets from a flexibility standpoint, especially when you consider that they have Reed Sheppard waiting in the wings, right? The Rockets are so internally high on Reed Sheppard. They truly believe that he is their point guard of the future, and that the backcourt of Reed Sheppard and Amin Thompson is going to pair beautifully at some point down the line. It's just a matter of when, not if, at least if you talk to anybody within the organization. And so, given Fred only having a 2-year deal, that means it gives you a little bit more optionality as far as potentially moving on to Reed Sheppard sooner rather than later, rather than having him kind of gated and being stuck behind Fred VanVleet in the depth chart for the foreseeable future. So really exciting stuff here. Absolutely fantastic deal for the Rockets. Great deal for Fred VanVleet. Shows that both sides are focused on the ultimate goal, which is winning at the highest level. Fred's sacrificing a little bit of money to give the Rockets that salary cap flexibility, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in just a second. And man, when you look at what the Rockets have done this offseason so far, between the Steven Adams, new contract, the team-friendly extension, Ime Udoka's extension, trading for Kevin Durant, now Fred VanVleet's new contract, and we haven't even hit free agency yet. The Rockets' brain trust of Rafael Stone, general manager, Eli Whitus, assistant GM, and Patrick Fertitta, as well as everybody else involved in the front office, they've absolutely been flat out killing it this offseason. This is what a good front office and a good, executive staff looks like at the end of the day. And just a ton of credit to all three of those guys in particular. That's kind of the Rockets' brain trust. They're the guys behind so many of the Rockets' big, important decisions. And really, ever since Tillman Fertitta went hands off, like after the Russell Westbrook trade debacle, like things have been running pretty smoothly for the Houston Rockets. So credit where credit is due. And I will say, I don't necessarily think they're done yet. I think that they know that there's still a couple stop gaps, a couple holes maybe in the roster that need to be filled, maybe still adding some shooting, looking to add somebody with that MLE this offseason, and or possibly facilitating a trade, maybe expanding on the initial framework of the Kevin Durant deal to loop in a third team. And you could factor in, trading away Jock Landale and Aaron Holiday's contracts to be able to bring in another impact player potentially. The Rockets have a lot of options there. So I'm sure that they're currently exploring all of them. And only time will tell whether or not the Rockets are able to pull something off either with the KD trade or just flat out signing somebody in free agency. But we'll have it covered for all that stuff a little bit further down the line. Coming up, want to talk about the NBA draft. Can we expect any movement from the Houston Rockets in the second round of the NBA draft on night 2? Also, are the Suns actually going to be good on defense, and how that might hurt the Rockets? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Wayfair. Look, there's nothing like stepping into your outdoor space and feeling like you've escaped to a personal oasis. If you're wanting to update your patio this season, Wayfair has made it so easy to turn it into a space that feels like yours, comfortable, stylish, and ready for summer. Wayfair has everything that you need to level up your outdoor space: conversation sets, outdoor bars, fire pits, hot tubs, gazebos, even the perfect string lights to set the vibe. It's like giving your backyard that resort feel without the resort price tag. Look, my girlfriend and I, we just did some work on the back patio, and we got four or five lounge chairs from Wayfair. And it's been awesome because having them set up out there, being able to entertain guests, whether it's just drinks on the back patio or like having a little board game night, if the weather's nice, it's awesome. It's like our own little personal slice of heaven. And you can experience that feeling too. Don't wait. Make your outdoor space your dream oasis today with Wayfair and enjoy it all summer long. Head to wayfair.com right now to shop a huge outdoor selection. That's wayfair.com, Wayfair.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, really quickly, before I get into some of the draft stuff that I did want to talk about, I want to try to revisit a little bit of the numbers from our cap breakdown episode. I did see some of the comments in there. I apologize if it wasn't as broken down or simple to digest as I hoped it would be. So I'm going to revisit it a little bit, and I hope I'm going to do it justice here because, again, I don't consider myself like a cap specialist or anything. So I'm going to try to break it down in the terminology that I understand it as. So really quickly, there are essentially kind of 4 tiers to an NBA salary cap, and those tiers and how they relate to what you can and can't do as a basketball team, as an organization. So there are under the cap teams, there are over the cap teams, then there are over the first apron teams, and then there are second apron teams, so over the second apron. And there are numbers associated with each one of these kind of like thresholds with your NBA payroll. I'll start at the top and work back down. The second apron kicks in at $207.8 million. The first apron kicks in at $195.9 million. The luxury tax line kicks in at $187.9 million. And that's where you start accruing luxury tax penalties, that kind of stuff. The salary cap for next season is projected to be at $154.6 million. So if you have, if your payroll is only $100 million and the cap is $154.6, that gap between that $54.6 million gap, that's when you have cap room. That's when teams create financial space and then they go out and dump a bunch of big money on a free agent, that kind of stuff. Now, as it relates to the Rockets and the concerns about being a second or a first apron team, it's because those things come with certain restrictions. There are a lot of things that you can't do when you become a second apron team. That's why teams get screwed when they become a second apron team. So basically, a few of the things that happen if you do become a second apron team. So first off, things You become hard capped at some of these lines if you utilize any of the exceptions or benefits of the previous tier. Because then if you were to say, use the full mid-level exception, right, worth $14.1 million, and that would take you over a certain threshold, then it's unfair, right? You don't get the benefit of the exception, and then you get to bump your payroll number up, and then suddenly it's like, oh, now we're a second apron team. No, there are certain things that you can and can't do, and it's all related to how much money you have on payroll. So as it stands, the Rockets actually cannot become a second apron team because one of the restrictions for the second apron teams is you cannot aggregate salary in trades, which is what the Rockets have done by sending Jalen Green and Dillon Brooks to Phoenix for Kevin Durant. So because they did that, they will not, or plan to do that, I apologize, trade hasn't happened yet. Because they plan to do that, they literally cannot become a second apron team. It's not allowed. They are hard capped. They cannot exceed that $207.8 million range. The other things that can't be done, if you're going to be a second apron team, you can't use the taxpayer MLE or any version of the MLE. You can't send out cash in a trade. You can't acquire a player that was used or using a TPE from the previous season. All these different things trigger the second apron and hard cap you, basically. The only things you can do, you can re-sign your own free agents, you can sign draft picks, you can sign players to minimum contracts, and you can make trades where one player's salary is sent out and is equal to or less than any combined salaries coming back. So basically, you can only trade one player at a time. You can take back more than one player, but you can only send out one player at a time. Those are the second apron teams. And if you'll remember, like at last year's draft, the Wolves were a second apron team, and they had no means to improve their roster, so they got creative with it. They traded with the San Antonio Spurs. They got the pick that became Rob Dillingham, because one of the few things that you can do as a second apron team is sign your own draft picks. So they added some backcourt help with Rob Dillingham by trading for a pick, no money involved, no players involved, and they traded future picks to get a pick right then and there that they were allowed to sign, even though they were a second apron team. Now, first apron teams, this is where things get a little bit trickier. Well, less tricky, just, it's a lot to try and follow. And hopefully I'm trying to break it down as simply as possible. First apron teams, if you use the taxpayer MLE, you become hard capped at the second apron. For first apron teams, though, if you use more than the taxpayer MLE, which this upcoming year, it projects to be $5.6 million. So if the Rockets use any version of their mid-level exception and they use $7 million, $8 million, $10 million, whatever, up to potentially the $14.1 million, which is the full amount of the non-tax MLE. If they go that route, then they become hard capped at the first apron, which again, that first apron number is $195.9 million. So they literally cannot exceed that salary number if they use their mid-level exception. Other exceptions, other triggers for the first apron, using the biannual exception, acquiring a player in a sign and trade, signing a buyout player who made more than the non-taxpayer MLE on a previous contract, using more than 100% salary matching in a trade, or using a TPE that was created prior to last season. So those are all the different things that trigger the first apron and that hard cap you at the first apron, meaning you cannot exceed that amount on your payroll. Now, where the Rockets are likely to be operating this upcoming season is as an over-the-cap team, but not a luxury tax team, because it benefits them to delay paying that repeater tax until a little bit further down the line. So the tax line is $187.9 million. And as it stands right now, with the Rockets still having Jock Landale, still Aaron Holiday, still Nate Williams, all the other pieces on their roster, plus Kevin Durant coming back, they have 12 out of 15 roster spots filled. Their projected salaries currently sit at $183.9 million, which means they have about $4 million of space between what they currently have on payroll versus hitting that luxury tax line. they currently still have access to the full non-tax mid-level exception of $14.1 million. But if they were to spend all of that $14.1 million, they would then exceed the $195.9 million first apron cap. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't want to enter that first apron because it limits you. It hurts you. And so for the Rockets, they have $12.1 million of space until they hit that first apron. And so they don't technically have full access to the non-tax mid-level exception, which is why you see a lot of people saying, oh, okay, they'll waive Jock Landale, they'll decline Aaron Holiday's option, and then they'll fill those slots with cheaper talent, vet minimum guys down the line, that kind of stuff. And that's where you get into kind of this song and dance with the roster and how you need to flesh out the final remaining spots with vet minimum contracts making a little over $2 million a year, or potentially second round picks who only make $1.2 million a year. So if the Rockets were to decline, right, or waive Jock Landale, that opens up an additional $8 million of room before they would hit that luxury tax threshold. So they could literally just waive Jock Landale, and that gives them approximately $12 million of space before they hit the luxury tax line. They could then decline Aaron Holiday's option. That gives them another $5-ish million of space. That's $17 million. And then they could go use some of that space, some of that money, 10, 12 million, maybe up to 14 million, to sign a free agent. And then they would need to flesh out the remaining roster spots with vet minimum contracts, or by, draft, trading back into the second round of the draft, drafting a second round pick, signing them to a contract which starts at $1.2 million, or signing undrafted free agents, right? Or re-signing their own free agents, right? The fact that they have Jeff Green and Jayshawn Tate are guys they might want to try and bring back on vet minimum deals, but they can't exactly give those guys more than that, unfortunately, because they are pressed up against some of these number lines that are going to have penalties or negative consequences if they go over some of these numbers. So I hope that breakdown explains it a little bit better, and why the Rockets are so delicately balancing the salary cap shenanigans. Again, by no means an expert on this stuff, but that's at least my rough understanding of where things kind of stand. And that's why, to bring the conversation full circle here, we didn't see any movement from the Houston Rockets in the first round of the draft. There was some reporting that maybe they would try to trade back into the first round of the draft if they could get to one of the prospects that they really, really liked. And then, by process of elimination, you kind of have to wonder, okay, well, what asset or assets would the Rockets have utilized to get back into the first round of the draft? And the obvious answer, unfortunately, is Cam Whitmore. Look, I love Cam Whitmore. I think he's got all the talent in the world. I really hope that he's still on this Rockets team come training camp, come the start of this next season. I think he's got a very big opportunity here to carve out a role for himself with the way that the roster has kind of opened up now, with no more Jalen Green, no more Dylan Brooks. But he's got to buy in defensively, right? And he's had some moments of kind of immaturity, some pouting this past season that don't really look good for him. And from the Rockets' perspective, Cam's already completed 2 years of his 4-year rookie contract. If they had eyes on a prospect that they really liked, and if they could dangle, and I'm assuming they tried to dangle Cam Whitmore in some of these discussions to maybe teams like the Wizards or the Nets with their 5 first-round picks, whatever. And essentially, it would have allowed the Rockets to reset the clock on Cam Whitmore's rookie contract, while still having a piece that they, bright future, young talent, whatever. Ultimately didn't happen. Maybe they dangle Cam for some second round picks. We don't know, but it'll be interesting to see what ultimately happens there. But if the Rockets are able to get their hands on a second round pick or two, that helps them tremendously with those salary cap numbers, because again, second round picks clock in at $1.2 million starting salary, as opposed to the 2.1, 2.2, whatever, that a vet minimum deal makes. So it's easier to sign a second round pick or an undrafted guy as kind of to fill out the rest, the end of your bench, basically, as opposed to going and signing, Joe Blow, who's been in the NBA for 7-8 years, to eat up a roster spot at the end of the bench, because all that money tallies up at the end of the day. And the Rockets are playing a very fine dance between being a tax-paying team and not being a tax-paying team, and potentially being, up against that first apron. So hopefully that is a decent enough explanation to make things a little bit easier to follow about what the Rockets are trying to do financially moving forward. Coming up, do want to talk about some of the other stuff from the first round of the NBA draft, namely the Phoenix Suns, and the fact that they might have a bit of a culture shift and some defensive identity this next season, and what that means for their future and the picks that the Rockets own from the Suns. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Skims. Look, when I found out Skims was making underwear for men, I'll admit I was intrigued. I've heard a lot about their quality from friends and family, so had to give them a try. And let me tell you, they absolutely live up to the hype. Look, having issues with underwear is the worst. Like, I'm a boxer briefs kind of guy. And the worst thing about boxer briefs, at least in my experience, is, you buy them, they're awesome, they're form-fitting, they're great when you first get them. And then within not even a couple months, few months of consistent wear and tear washes, they lose their shape. They don't hug you the right way anymore. It's frustrating. I love the Skims stretch 5-inch boxer briefs. Those are my favorite ones. I tried a couple different pairs, but that's the one that I like the most. They're awesome. They're perfect for an active lifestyle. They move with me. They never lose their shape, and they stay in place all day long. Whether you're working out or just running errands, you need to give them a shot. Try making the switch to Skims Men's. Shop Skims Men's at skims.com. Let them know that we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey menu that drops, in the drop-down menu that follows, and select our show to let them know that we sent you. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right. Quick thoughts on the first round of the NBA draft. Things kind of going chalk there at the top. Cooper Flagg to Dallas, Dylan Harper to the Spurs, VJ Edgecombe to the 76ers. Hornets taking Con Knipple, and then the first little bit of a shakeup in the draft happening at pick 5 with Ace Bailey. Man, talk about a disaster class in pre-draft, just everything, because Ace Bailey tried so hard to tank his draft stock to get to one of Washington or New Orleans or Brooklyn, and failed in doing so, with the Utah Jazz deciding to swoop in and take him at pick 5. And on draft night, he looked pissed. He looked so, on what's supposed to be the best night of his life, he looked so upset. Just terrible, terrible advice from his agent, the overall direction that he took. And I'll tell you what, I don't know. That's not the kind of guy that I would be wanting to try and build a team around. I'm just saying. So, and that wasn't the only one, because you also had Colin Murray Boyles, who got drafted to the Raptors, and he literally looked like he dropped an F-bomb when he found out he was going to Toronto. It was funny to see his reaction. So it's weird that these, it's supposed to be a special night. You made it to the NBA, whatever. And some of these players are just upset about where they landed. And it's dude, you made it to the NBA. Be happy. What I will say, and what I want to address mostly here in this segment, as well as maybe a few other tidbits about the first round, was the Phoenix Suns making some impressive moves, dare I say. Kaman Malawach falling to pick 10 was not something that I expected at all. I really thought that he'd be off the board. I thought that the Pelicans desperately needed a big man. I thought he'd be an option to go to them. I thought that the Raptors were for sure going to take him at pick 9 if he was still on the board. And lo and behold, he makes it all the way to pick 10. Rockets make the selection for the Phoenix Suns, which means the Phoenix Suns adding the defensive presence out of Duke. And then subsequently, they not only make that selection at pick 10, with Kaman Malawach being there, surprisingly, having fallen that far in the draft, they also traded for Mark Williams. So the Suns went from basically just having Nick Richards at their 5 spot to suddenly having Mark Williams, Kaman Malawach, and Nick Richards, a little triumvirate of bigs, 2 of which defensive minded, although Mark Williams is a pseudo defensive big. He's not a real defensive big. He's, he gets big numbers, he rebounds, but he's not a phenomenal defender. Maybe things change in Phoenix, maybe different with a motor, but also TBD on whether or not he actually passes his physical. But these 2 pickups for the Suns. And then you also factor in, right, they have Ryan Dunn on their roster, who was absolutely an all defensive caliber player this past season. Dylan Brooks added to the mix. Jalen Green, who's become a very solid defender in his own right. Devin Booker, who can defend when he's locked in and engaged and not, going through the motions out there. Like Royce O'Neal, if they keep him, I don't know, the Suns might actually be like a decent defensive team this next season. And that's concerning because we want to see the Suns implode. We want to see them fall apart at the seams, and we want to see that 2027 pick convey in the juiciest of fashions, becoming, a top 10 or even a top 5 pick would be a phenomenal outcome for that pick, not just 2 years down the line. Now, don't get it twisted. There's still a lot that the Suns have to do and improve upon, and they're trying to trade Grayson Allen and Royce O'Neal, and who knows what that team actually looks. And they're still straddled with Bradley Beal. So it's not like the Suns are suddenly like a threat in the Western Conference, but they might actually be building towards something that's a bit more sustainable in the long term. And both Malawach and Williams are solid pickups for a team that desperately needed some defensive integrity, some size at the 5 spot. And yeah, so you could envision their starting lineup if they elect to, move on from Bradley Beal or buy him out or trade him if there's a team dumb enough to take Bradley Beal's contract on. If they have a starting lineup of Devin Booker, Jalen Green, Ryan Dunn, Dylan Brooks at the 4, and then Mark Williams at the 5, and kind of alternating Mark Williams with Kaman Malawach getting 15-20 minutes a night, that's a pretty decent defensive lineup. It's not going to be like top 10 or anything, but they might be potentially kind of middle of the pack defensively. And then depending on how things look offensively for their team, they might actually be potentially turning some things around here. And that sucks because, again, just like when we did all the Nets pick watch stuff for years, kind of, sitting here and looking at the outcome of what, the disaster that ultimately hit the Nets and preying on their downfall. Now we continue to prey on the downfall of the Phoenix Suns. And credit where credit is due. Brian Gregory, the Suns front office, they made a good selection with Malawach. They made a smart trade for Mark Williams. We'll see what happens, because if Williams can't stay healthy, then it's probably a terrible trade. But I don't know. It's one of those where you look at the outcome of this and it's not ideal from a Rockets perspective, but the Suns also play in a brutal Western Conference. And so the likelihood of them actually making any kind of noise, they might be a plucky fringe play-in team this next upcoming season. And then, they're one significant injury away to either of, basically what if Booker misses any significant amount of time at all, that Suns team is going to flounder. And that's, the concern with their lack of depth, their lack of solid rotational pieces, around Devin Booker. So I think it's a step in the right direction for them, but it's not like some massive leap into them being, a playoff caliber team all of a sudden. So I just figured I'd address it here on the show because it does impact the Rockets and the picks that they still own via the Phoenix Suns further down the line. Another team, though, that I do want to highlight because it's just so ridiculous. What the hell are the Pelicans doing, man? Joe Dumars, what is he smoking? Because the Pelicans take Jeremiah Fears with their 7th overall pick, and then they make what is arguably, not even arguably, it fell out of it. It's the worst trade of the NBA offseason so far, easily the worst trade of draft night, where they trade a 2026, next year's pick, fully unprotected, the best of their own pick or the Milwaukee Bucks pick. Keep in mind, the Bucks have a Damian Lillard injury and a depleted roster and very few prospects on the horizon. The Bucks could be an awful team this next year. If Giannis misses a chunk of time, it's game over for the Bucks. That pick could convey top 5 from Milwaukee. They traded that pick to Atlanta to move up just 10 spots in the draft from pick 23 to pick 13 to draft Derek Queen. Now, look, I like Derek Queen, and obviously the Pelicans do too, and they really wanted to pair him in their front court with Zion Williamson. Makes sense. But for a team that just won 21 games, 21-61 this past season, to bank on the health of Zion Williamson, which has not been a very bankable asset in, so far in his career, Pelicans are a disaster waiting to happen. And they're still going to be missing DeJounte Murray for part of the season too. Like, I have no idea what Dumars and the Pelicans are doing. And one of my closest friends, he's a diehard Pelicans fan. If you're an everydayer, you'll probably remember him. He's my guy, Chris. He usually comes on during NBA All-Star Weekend and helps recap the All-Star Weekend stuff. I don't think he did it this past year. We had some conflicts, but he's been on here a few different times on the show in previous years. But I feel for him because, like, he was like just into me. Like, he was like, being a Pelicans fan is so exhausting. I feel for him. I really do. Pell's just a total mess. And then last thing that I'll talk about from the draft is I'm really shocked that the Nets made all 5 of their first round selections. Honestly, they had 5 first round picks. Everybody had them pegged as like making a trade or packaging some picks to trade up. And they were just like, nope, we're going to take all 5 guys. Sean Marks afterwards was like, we believe each and every one of these guys has untapped potential. Talk about a big swing, man. That's literally 1/3 of your roster right there in brand new rookie signings. That's how you tank. Like Sean Marks is literally taking a page out of the Rockets playbook from when they drafted Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, Josh Christopher, and Usman Garuba, and signed 4 rookies, and then just went into the next season with like no veteran presence, just rolling the ball out there, losing a ton of games. That's what it feels like the Nets are about to do this next season with all these young guys that they're going to be employing. It's going to be ridiculous. With that, I want your thoughts on Fred VanVleet's contract extension. I want your thoughts on the cap stuff that we talked about. Would you like to see the Rockets try and buy back into or trade back into the second round of the NBA draft? Are there any players that you would have your eyes on if the Rockets can get back into the second round of the draft? Rasheer Fleming, not drafted in the first round, kind of ridiculous. I don't think he'd be a pick that the Rockets would be able to get to because it probably cost a lot to get into the top part of the second round. The Minnesota Timberwolves right there at pick 31, probably fielding a lot of calls for teams that are interested in Rasheer Fleming. But I will say one name that I really do like for the Rockets in the second round of the draft, Ryan Kalkbrenner. That kid would come in. He's like a traditional defensive drop big. He looks like he's working on his 3-ball. He looks like a copy paste of Brook Lopez, honestly. I think I've talked about him a little bit on the show before, but that would be a guy that I'd love for the Rockets to maybe take a look at, especially if they're going to be losing Jock Landale, if they need to waive him to clear that $8 million of salary off the books. It'd be nice for them to have at least one more big man option to go to if, Sengun misses any time or Steven Adams misses any time or needs to sit out some back-to-backs. Yes, they still have Jabari Smith Jr. that they can run as their small ball 5. And yes, they've still got like Nafali Dante on a 2-way, like waiting in the wings, but Ryan Kalkbrenner looks like he's going to be a really serviceable big man at the NBA level. So I think the Rockets should absolutely take a look at him. But give me your thoughts on potential second round targets, Fred's contract, all that good stuff. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.